Doctor Who. High popular culture for difficult times. Today may become my favourite podcast. Cultural studies scholars are intellectuals of enthusiasms. The fan intellectual is a really important label that we deploy. It's a state, it's a status, it's a mode of thinking, it's a mode of being for those of us who live and work in cultural studies. But the popular culture that we're often drawn to is the pop that has longevity. So here we're talking about Star Trek, Star Wars, James Bond, and the topic of our podcast today, Doctor Who. Doctor Who is a BBC series that began in 1963 with An Unearthly Child. The Doctor was played by the great British actor William Bill Hartnell. 13 actors have played the role, enabled by a remarkable event in television and script writing called a regeneration. That was the way for a story to continue, the program to continue, even as the actors changed. Now 52 years young, Doctor Who is often broken into three periods. The classic series, 1963 to 1989, the television film, which was much less successful, in 1996, Yawn, and the extraordinary revival from 2005 to the present. Cultural studies has also shown an interest with the influential John Tulloch and Alvarado Manuel book, Doctor Who, The Unfolding Text, out of print, but you can still get copies of it. And this book was published in 1983. It's a really important book. It may not have had the profile of a lot of the Routledge books at the time, but it was important because, again, remember that year, 1983, it captured that early and really complex period of cultural studies that aligned the early English literature, literary semiotic, and the sociological, social semiotic strand. It was all a bit complicated and agitated and very, very interesting because the strands of disciplinarity were coming together in a way that still had their origins, still had the seam of the join. So Doctor Who combined the text and the context in an intimate and really complex way. But since that great book in 1983, cultural studies has neglected Doctor Who, moving perhaps rightly to Breaking Bad, The Walking Dead, and Game of Thrones. So today I want to address this gap. I'd like to bring a discussion of Doctor Who forward to understand how it's working within contemporary theory, and perhaps the rebooting of Doctor Who can provide a mechanism for the rebooting of cultural studies. So I'm joined on this journey today to bring sexy back, to bring cultural studies back and really think about Doctor Who in an innovative theoretical way with my companion through sound and vision, Professor Steve Redhead. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning.
Now this is exciting and we're going to start with your personal narrative. So your personal narrative aligns with the narrative of the program because you watched, as a very, very young child, the first episode of An Unearthly Child on the BBC in its first, and we may talk about it in a second, in its second rerun as well. So what's your memory of that first episode after all these years?
I've always distinctly remembered watching the first episode. It was on a Saturday night in England, in Blackpool, in fact, Australia. And I can distinctly remember watching it with Hartnell, who's always been the sort of measure of the Doctor Who's, because it was such a powerful thing on me as a kid. Basically, I can actually see very vividly the black and white TV that was in the corner of the room in my family home in Blackpool, and I can distinctly remember watching it at a Saturday tea time. Saturday night was, in my family case, after the football, which was not televised in those days, but after the football matches I did my dad's pools at this time, and then I can remember Doctor Who being on. And I can also remember the sort of programmes that were on in that sort of period as well. But I was distinctly disturbed by it as a young person, basically. But I also thought of it as a futuristic thing. I thought about it as a futuristic thing then, and another event I can remember from that period on that same black and white TV in the family room was actually news of the Cuban Missile Crisis a year before, and I can just remember that too. Those two events, in some ways, Cuban Missile Crisis news, I thought the future wasn't going to be, and actually Doctor Who, this futuristic TV programme, which seemed to be completely different to anything else that was on the TV at the time. Those two events are connected in my mind.
And intriguingly, you didn't add the one other variable that delayed the broadcast, the first broadcast of An Unearthly Child, which was, of course...
The Kennedy assassination, which has also fascinated me for decades.
Yes, in a slightly more disturbing way. But what's interesting is, of course, it was slightly delayed because of the Kennedy assassination coverage, and then the BBC replayed it the following week, the same episode,
yes,
so that they would actually gain an audience for it. So much to say about that, Steve, because that initial episode, which I think has been reissued in many different platforms and modes and still holds up, it's a tremendous script, but you can understand, I can certainly understand what you're talking about, that... I don't know what modernity is through its multiple definitions, but when you see that first episode of Unearthly Child, there she sits. That is modernity. Yes. And it came back very powerfully, and we'll talk about Peter Capaldi and the last episode of Series 9, which is Hell Bent, where they actually brought the first console of the TARDIS back, the Bill Hartnell console back, and it still looked modern, innovative, startling. The whiteness of the room was incredibly powerful with this, elderly English gentleman. Of course, he was actually younger than Peter Capaldi, and indeed younger than you are now.
Yes.
But people saw him as this grandfather
Absolutely,
figure.
that was part of my memory. What I saw as this old man.
Yeah, and again, we'll talk about ageing in a second, because Doctor Who also has followed through the relationship between ageing and popular culture, but we'll come back there. But I think you've captured that. Remember, this was also the period of the Beatles as well, where sonic modernity was being enveloped. So most people of your age and older remember the first time they heard a Beatles song, because that was a sonic rupture, and Doctor Who was a visual rupture.
Yes.
And I think we've lost that.
Yes. I remember hearing Love Me Do in December 1962, so a year before this programme, on the radio, and thinking this was modernity.
Yes, you were a very far-sighted child, but there was a sense it was new, it was innovative, this was special. And we've talked a little bit about Saturday night television, and you've really got to live in England to understand what the Saturday night thing is about, because it's about family television, moving from children's broadcasting into light entertainment. I would argue nobody does light entertainment like the British, both ITV and also BBC. But I particularly want to talk about BBC in the next question, Steve. The BBC really has a heritage for innovative and I would say edgy programming, and of course there's all the problems with the censors all the way through in the BBC's history, but really the rest of the world does not do programming like this. So I'm thinking about in the radio period, The Goon Show, Monty Python, but also Doctor Who. So what is it about that particular mode of public broadcasting that creates this level of innovation?
I think certainly in the period that we're talking about where Doctor Who starts, BBC was seen as this, still a Reithian public broadcaster. This is good for you. Basically, the commercial TV, and there was only one other channel at the time, which was the commercial channel ITV. The idea of TV being good for you was really powerful. And I think that was there for another 20 years, to be honest, until Thatcher and the free market dismantled it. And
can I also just do a pause for international listeners, Steve? Firstly, if you're interested in the history of the BBC and the Reithian element, look to Asa Briggs' Great History of the BBC. But also, this is classed, this early history at this point, and we should probably talk about the radio split that still existed through the war and just after the war, which was the Light programme, the Home programme, and the Third. And so the Light was for the working class, bread and circuses. The home program was for the earnest upper working class, lower middle class, and the third was just sort of let's play some more Wagner and hope this makes sense at some point.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's also a very classed history. So Steve, let's go back to TV. So continue on from there.
So production values were incredibly important.
Yes.
And you can see that even in the music, in the amazing technologically futuristic music of Doctor Who, which really did come from left field.
Radiophonic workshop.
Yeah. And decades later is still recognised in that way. So I think it was I would, as a kid, I wasn't necessarily aware of that split. I only really realised it later, as I did popular cultural history myself. But I think there was no doubt that Doctor Who was part of that great production values. This was public money, and public money well spent. And this was a leading, cutting-edge way of doing things.
Yeah, and I should also add, we're going to talk about children and children's media next, in my next question, but I'd just like to pause at this point in terms of disclosing and discussing the Reithian elements of Doctor Who, and particularly with the first two iterations of Doctor Who, William Hartnell and the legendary Patrick Troughton, that I think really we're forgetting a little bit in this history. He is so
superb.
important.
Yeah, and again, very important in my childhood.
Yeah, if Patrick Troughton hadn't made that role his own, and with his comedic performances bouncing off a sort of Charlie Chaplin role, that program would have died with Bill Hartnell. So it actually is Troughton that made it popular culture. But what I particularly want to say in terms of those Reithian elements in the first two Doctors is, if you might remember, they did a lot of history programs.
Yes.
So they retold elements of history. They went to the Highland clearances. They did all these revisionings of history for the educative element for the kiddies.
Yes.
So, yes, there were these science fictional elements, but particularly early on, they went back as much as they went forward.
Yes.
And so it was there even in children's television.
Yeah.
And we will keep going with children's television because right from the start, you were a very little fella at that point, and Doctor Who was children's television.
Yes.
Now, I've taught through my career a lot of children's media, children's television, children's literature, terribly interested in it, and I often argue it is the most complicated of popular cultural forms because it has to operate simultaneously in multimodalities. There's got to be a greater knowingness and consciousness when you're in children's media than you're out of it, right? So how important was that labelling of Doctor Who as children's broadcasting very early in the schedule for that light entertainment Saturday? Was it important politically, socially, culturally to say, oh, look, Doctor Who, it's children's telly?
I think it was blurred from the start, though.
Interesting.
Because, as I say, I can see in my mind's eye that black and white TV and the family, which was my father, my mother, at that time my sister, who was one of my sisters, who was actually 2 years younger than me. We all sat down to watch that on a Saturday night as you were watching anything else, actually.
As a family.
Yeah,
one television, two channels.
It wasn't necessarily seen as children's media in that way. Although, as I grew older as a teenager, I did get interested in science fiction, for example, but reading science fiction. I certainly did by the time I went to university. But I saw myself as growing out of a programme like Doctor Who. So I watched it until I went to university. But actually, for the next 20 years, I had a family of my own, young daughters who didn't actually take that, weren't interested in that programme. They were interested in other things. So I watched with them other things, other children's programmes. But actually, by the time I went to university, I'd kind of lost interest because I saw it as children's media.
Yeah.
I didn't have a TV when I was a student at the University of Manchester, so I never saw the things. So it's quite interesting that early power of what was a children's TV programme kind of waned on me after the 1960s. And then I only started watching it again when we met, which was 15 years ago. And your fandom actually rekindled my interest. So I think it was the fact that I saw it eventually as a children's thing, which I'd grown out of.
See, that's quite fascinating. Also, can I say, when you went to university, when you did watch television, you'd moved to Monty Python, of course.
I have, but even then, I've realised with reruns of Monty Python. I missed a lot because I didn't have a TV.
So it just means so in some ways the early history and heritage in the 60s was very much children's television.
Yes.
Moving into Pertwee and moving into Tom Baker. And I think probably Tom Baker's important in this narrative because it's really the Tom Baker doctor that got it into the United States.
Yes.
And I'm not knocking Pertwee. I think Pertwee was a remarkable doctor, and without Pertwee hanging in there, doing all that profound work, probably quite cheaply, if you remember, there were very few aliens and so forth because Pertwee's doctor was on the planet, on Earth, for a lot of the time. So he really held the fort. But it was Tom Baker's doctor who rendered it popular memory, I think.
Yes.
And then, of course, we went into Peter Davidson, the much younger, attractive doctor, all creatures great and small and so forth.
Yes.
So that period perhaps was missed, or it was a bit of a disconnection in the UK as Doctor Who moved much more into the world.
Internationally, I think that's true. Yeah.
Because in Australia, it was everywhere.
Yeah.
It was, and it still is, absolutely everywhere. Canada, it's everywhere. Yeah. So as it internationalised, the reputation in Britain of children's literature and children's media probably hurt it a bit.
Yes, and I was interested in older, if you like, more adult, what I saw as more adult science fiction.
Yes.
And fiction.
And I'm interested, when you watch it now, and obviously we've watched a lot of those earlier episodes together as well, do you see the adult rendering of programs that you saw as a child and realise the layers?
Yes, yeah.
Interesting. Now, Doctor Who, we've talked about sort of the challenges of managing these international markets and managing the complexity of a long-running television program. And Doctor Who had a gap between 1989 and 1996 with that really pretty dodgy film, and then between 96 and 2005. Yeah. So when I say a gap, when we were in the middle of the gap, we thought Doctor Who would never come back, because you only know it's a gap backwards after it starts again. When it finished in 1989 with Sylvester McCoy and Colin Baker, and Colin Baker I think was great, they were having all sorts of problems with the BBC at the time, I thought that was the end. Yeah. I thought Colin Baker's Doctor would be the last Doctor. But then it came back in 2005, just in an incredible suite of innovative and powerful television programs. And again, like I always talk about the importance of Patrick Troughton, the importance of Christopher Eccleston, I don't think we can underestimate or underplay. Extraordinary actor, and he really rebooted Doctor Who because of his really powerful acting, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, what's interesting to me is the Major and the Blair years were not kind to the Doctor. There was no space for a Doctor Who type figure under those political regimes. So what do you think Russell T Davies, the legendary Russell T Davies, and Chris Eccleston did that was so right, that was able to reboot it in 2005 to such success?
Yeah, I think there was definitely, I mean, you're absolutely right that these are individual talents that almost single-handedly rebooted the whole thing. Yeah. And I absolutely agree. Great writing, great production, also great acting. I absolutely agree with you, with Christopher Eccleston. Somebody, one of my favourite contemporary actors, basically.
Friends in the North.
Things like Our Friends in the North and Cracker still stand up.
The Second Coming, amazing.
Absolutely. But he was able to drag the thing out of the doldrums. But I also think there's a creative industries context to this.
Nice one.
That actually, by the time that the BBC and Doctor Who and production in Wales produced all of this, there was a huge momentum in the Blair years on creative industries, basically. I did a lot of work for the Blair government, for example, and then the Jeff Gallop government in Perth in Western Australia on creative industries. I chaired their creative industries task force. And I was picking up on something which was really rising from the ashes of the destruction of Thatcher years, particularly the major years. People forget how neoliberal, how new right the major years were. They really completed the free market destruction.
Major was more Thatcher than Thatcher.
Very much so. And so was Blair. Yeah. So were Blair and Brown. But in the Blair and Brown era, there was more public money to spend, even though it was connected to private financing. The creative industries did definitely develop. There's no doubt about that. And Doctor Who, produced in Wales and with some really great production values, reminiscent of the early BBC, actually is very important to remember. And I think that's what gave it the momentum. It was individual stars, it was individual writers and production values, but actually there's a greater context to this. And in some ways you've had that for a decade.
Yeah.
2005 to 2015.
And look, I think that's an incredibly important point. You know, who knew that Cardiff would be one of the great intellectual cultural hubs of the planet?
Yep.
Of course it was always going to happen. There were always fantastic cultural elements, great literary cultures, for example, in Cardiff. And I think, and this is just an argument to put out there for colleagues to listen to on the podcast, probably Doctor Who had to leave London.
Yes.
To reboot and be successful. It had to get out of that sort of star-trapped, the BBC hierarchy, all the nonsense that caused so many of the problems for Colin Baker in that particular manifestation. It had to start again fresh, which we might talk about in a second, but also allow a new environment to infuse creativity. And it was highly creative, risky, edgy television.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Now, we're going to talk about the other Doctors shortly, and we've talked about a lot of them so far. But let's focus on David Tennant and Matt Smith. They were, without a doubt, the prettiest Doctors, and they were probably the most American-friendly. And there's a whole American, BBC America narrative and commercialisation that's part of this story as well. But there was a sense, I think, with Tennant and particularly with Smith, that they rarely accessed the popular memory of Doctor Who. It was almost as if Eccleston was the first Doctor rather than Hartnell. So do you think that there was a problem in their programming? And again, they were very popular and still are very popular. Do you think there was a problem there because they basically erased history and lived in this sort of authentic, inauthentic present?
I think I felt it at the time that that's what they were doing, interestingly enough. And I were reflecting on it now, but I do, even though I enjoyed those series, and I think particularly Tennant,
fine actor,
incredible acting skills. I'm a real fan of him in all sorts of other areas. But I think you're right. I think it was, in some ways, it was quite anodyne. And in some ways, the globalisation of TV programmes for an American audience, and I mean that in ways, you're Americanising everything.
Yeah.
Great series like Shameless and The Office, for example, were redone by the US.
Because the original wasn't good enough because
That's
it
right.
wasn't American.
But in this case, this is not redoing it, it's actually making it blander and more banal. Still really interesting series, but I think there's no doubt that that's what happened. And that's why the later Doctor Who, the most recent Doctor Who's, particularly through people like Capaldi, are actually really quite something else.
Yes, and we'll talk about what that something else is in a second. Could I also just put in, a footnote, a thought bubble for people to think about, and you can please disagree with me, but when the program was Americanised, it was also rendered infantile.
Yes,
so
back to children's media.
So it became a little bit more children's media and for the fans. Yeah. So I could be wrong there, but think about that.
I think you're right.
Yeah. So after Matt Smith, the fear I had was that the Doctors would get progressively younger and younger and younger and prettier and prettier and prettier. And in fact, they'd end up throwing a fetus into the TARDIS and hoping for the best. Then arrived Peter Capaldi. Now, I put Peter Capaldi up there with Troughton and with Eccleston because I think they've provided this program with an incredible service. They came in at a period where the program could have died, actually. So it made, we didn't give them as much credit as we should because actually a hell of a lot of the burden of popular memory was on these guys and they made it work. So let's just start with the impressions. What's been your impression of Peter Capaldi? And there's so much to say, but let's just put some tropes out there. How is ageing, life and death operating through his face, through his voice, through his narrative, through his actions?
I think he's almost Shakespearean.
Yes.
I really do. And I was always a big fan, and I thought The Thick of It was absolutely fantastic, and the film out of the series In the Loop. But I've always enjoyed him as an actor. But even then, actually, this was a leap. And he has been absolutely astonishing. But I think in some ways this is moving TV to something almost post-TV.
Hello.
He's been involved in that. That's what I mean about it, the Shakespearean thing. It's almost taking this back to a kind of stage.
Yeah.
It really is theatrical in a way that perhaps we haven't seen on mainstream TV for a long time.
Yeah, and also if we can just go, we're going to talk about Heaven Sent, the second last episode in Series 9 in a second. But that was in, of course, as our podcast listeners might know, in a puzzle box of a castle. Yeah. So it literally was this intense, almost stage-like configuration where it was a soliloquy. It was basically 55 minutes of him. But how are you feeling about the notion of aging? Because when he was appointed as the Doctor, if you like, or he got the casting, there was all this stuff about he was too old. And of course, at that point, he was still younger than Hartnell, I think. And, you're too old to play the Doctor. We had beautiful Tennant and the supposedly beautiful, although I never quite got the Matt Smith thing, but and now we're with this old bloke and, what are we going to do with that? How did that happen? Is that just ageism?
I think that it's part of a context of, particularly in TV, but, media industries generally, because you talk about image, where women in particular, over a certain age, have just been sacked.
Have disappeared.
There have been lots of legal cases. This is, a great example of the precariat in creative industries. Actually, there have been certainly in Britain, there have been lots of legal cases about discrimination, particularly against women, but also on the basis of age in general. So what Capaldi has done is actually bring that narrative into the series. I think there's a really important context here, but it's almost doing it through his own incredible force of personality and talent in acting.
Yeah, because we've now reached a point with particularly a lot of reality television, a lot of these pseudo-celebrities, I'll mention the word Kardashians, I'll just put that out there. And
that's the consequences
of, the Botoxification of culture and life is that we no longer actually see anybody with lines or creases on their face. No. So when we do, there is a shock element there. Yeah, there is. Like, wow, their forehead is moving. That's unusual. So they've actually put that into the narrative. So the whole gig is really about life and death and ageing. And there's that line in Deep Breath, which was Capaldi's first full episode, where he said, just see me. Why can't you see me? She's wanting this young, pretty boy, and she's not actually seeing the person in front of her, which is, the same person, but with a different face that she's ignoring because he's aged.
Yes. And I think it's also about, as I say, the context certainly is about aging and ageism, but it's also about the precariousness of the world, what I would call claustropolitanism. Yeah. And it's almost the case that Capaldi as Doctor Who has actually coincided with endless global war, the post-global financial crisis condition, which I call claustropolitanism. I think we're only picking up on what the world actually looks like now, how social justice is so necessary, a rebooting of universal values and so on. That's what Doctor Who does. This particular period of the programme is taking on an immense social role. And it is ageism, and it's ageing, and it's those sorts of things, but I think they're part of a more precarious capitalism, global capitalism. Yeah. And that's what, in my view, the programme is commentating on.
Yeah, and instead of going back to the history plays like Troughton and Hartnell did, he's now entering political morality tales. I'm thinking clearly about the episodes where he's exploring war.
Yes.
And there was
and peace.
There's about a 90-second speech, again, pretty well on his own, arguing against war in a time when there's wars everywhere. Yep. War is everywhere. He's also done a whole series of speeches. At one episode, of course, was Face the Raven, was based in a refugee camp. Yep. I mean, come on. Yep. You don't have to be working at multiple levels. A lot of this is literal. Team, let's talk about refugees. Team, let's talk about war. So they're direct. This is not mediated through science fiction. This is not a folk tale. No. There's a lot of direct commentary with what's going on at the moment.
And I think it's necessary. Why it's still popular and powerful, it's necessary to have that kind of mediation in societies which are literally breaking down structurally.
Yeah. And I also, just before we finish the point about ageing, can I say there's also a fantastic group of women on Twitter, enormous respect to all the Capaldi guys and gals who are obsessed on Twitter, that of course are beyond focused on the sexuality of Peter Capaldi. There's a whole group that have captured just about every image on screen when Peter Capaldi is wet. So they've decided they really think that wet Peter Capaldi is about as sexy as things get. And I'll just quote the hashtag they use, hashtag oh my ovaries. So there's a whole group that, again, have critiqued this ageing. They don't want the pretty boy. And suddenly, Capaldi has become literally sex on legs for a whole group of the internet. And again, because of the online environment, we can monitor these fan groups too. So that is very powerful, I think. Capaldi has been described on and off Twitter as the Uber doctor, bringing forward all of the doctors into the present, which makes it very different, I would argue, from Tennant and Smith. Yes. So what has been the role of popular memory of Doctor Who, but also the heritage of the program in the current manifestation?
I think you're right. I think that is what's happened. I think he's double-coded it brilliantly.
Yes.
So that you've got deliberate, significant references, signs of previous doctors, of previous programmes, of previous history of TV, which are constantly being made in the programme. And yet, and that obviously works for people like me who were around the first time, but increasingly, that double coding works to make it a very powerful piece of TV for younger admirers of the programme, but also people of whatever age who are coming to it for the first time.
It also makes it much more complex, and this is where we start to get a bit more into cultural studies in terms of the fetishisation of the text, if you will, because there have been plenty of episodes through the Capaldi configuration of Doctor Who that require not just seeing it twice, but there's multiple ones like Hellbent that you're needing to see 5, 6, 7 times because the speed at which the references are coming at you, even people are sort of eloquently, as literate as we are missing all of these references. So the texts are heavy. Yes. The texts are laden. They're saturated with these references. Stuff as flippant, as simple as wearing the Patrick Troughton pants, the checked pants. So that was a lovely reference through it. But, for example, in Heaven Sent, there were about 7 minutes where Capaldi took on Tom Baker's voice for the voiceover. So actually it sounded like Tom Baker's doctor. So it's all these incredibly intricate relationships, and I think that's astounding. So it's visual, but it's also sonic, and it's layered, and it's rendering this thing much beyond any simple popular cultural text.
Very much so. I mean, it's cosmological. Yeah. One of the reasons why I was so powerfully affected by the first Doctor Who series as a kid was actually that I realised later that I was interested in things like speed and why I got into theories like Paul Virilio, and also space-time, which again Virilio is really interesting on, as are many science fiction writers. But I think that kind of subject matter is heavy. And that's the thing. It's an incredibly clever, high popular culture that Capaldi is performing, dealing with, as I say, issues as diverse as social justice, as speed and accelerated culture and space-time. I mean, all in 40 minutes. But, how do you do that?
Yeah, but then also wearing Ray-Bans, playing a guitar, making an entrance in on a tank.
Yes.
So this is astounding stuff. And I think a lot of that comes from the lightness of touch for the heaviest of content comes because he was a fan.
Yes. And brilliant writing, I must admit.
Yeah.
Some of the script writing is just phenomenal.
Yes, it is. But I think we mustn't underestimate that Capaldi, from a very young bloke, was a fan of Doctor Who. And so he comes to it with this heritage, with this legacy. He's not taking the mickey. He's not taking the piss out of it. This is his heritage. This is his canon. And I think also what's so fascinating to me is early on, just as he was made the Doctor, he, I think, configured himself to work with the Pertwee Doctor in a really interesting way, through the clothing, through the jackets, through the red lining, because again Pertwee's been lost in some ways through this history, and yet Pertwee was really the big important doctor for Capaldi as he was growing up. And so he's brought that heritage back through. For example, if you look at all the photographs of Capaldi, they could be the Pertwee photographs. Yes. So he's doing it with that level of consciousness and cleverness. And we'll now go, I think, to what I think are the greatest episodes of Doctor Who, and actually I think two of the greatest moments in television history. I know it seems a big rap, but I'm prepared to back that up. And they were the last two episodes of the 2015 series Heaven Sent and Hell Bent. Now, you've already mentioned claustropolitanism in the talk we've had today, and you've explored that term particularly in the last 3, 4, 5 years, but in the last 2 years with intensity. So has Doctor Who now entered claustropolitanism?
I certainly think with the last two episodes, which were very powerful, and we watched them several times because there was so much in them. But I think particularly in the present context, the present global context, which I've tried to explore in different ways, different media, different culture, but actually I still think I've got something.
You have.
Claustropolitanism came from the idea that Paul Virilio put forward, which was basically his suggestion in 2008 that Cosmopolitan Society, was moving to what he called claustropolis. And I took his notion of claustropolis, which he has a particular vision of, and developed it as a kind of post-crash cultural condition. Really, I suppose one way of explaining it would be the idea that you want to get off the planet.
Yeah.
And I think the intensity, the acceleration of the virtual is actually part of that. You know, the feeling that you do want to get off the planet with all of the things, the endless global war, the precariousness of society and of employment, you know, the rise of the right globally and so on, all those things. So I think there is something there, and I think, even though he may not, Peter Capaldi might not explain it in this way, I think he's got a sense that, and you feel it in these most recent programmes, that this is something powerful. This is something with a message, a morality, if you like, in a time when there is collapse and decline, even though that's uneven, of what we knew, the tectonic shifts in culture and in economics and politics around the globe at the moment are actually captured in these programmes. I know that seems a great and overblown claim, but I really think that's the case. And if you've got the sense, particularly of that claustropolitanism, say, in the first of those two most recent programmes, you get the idea, it's almost a panopticism. Jeremy Bentham's panopticon is actually within, in time and space. And I really felt that in that programme. And again, it's the sense of, you know, feeling closed in, feeling foreclosed.
Yeah, and I mean, when we saw the puzzle box of a castle that he couldn't get out of,
the resetting,
and it was instantly resetting, I immediately thought of claustropolitanism. He was trapped in his own series of nightmares, and of course, then that notion of desperately trying to get off the planet. He literally was. What was the figure? Was it? I think about 3 different figures used, but like he was trying to get through this sort of harder than diamond wall for 4.6 billion years, right? And he was having to burn his own body up to get the energy, to get the imprint of his former self, to start it over and over. I mean, so you're trying to get off the planet and you can't. And you have to burn yourself up to have another go. I mean, this was...
it really was Virillian. And, I'm sure that if you asked Peter Capaldi about it, he wouldn't agree. But I think the general sense of what was happening in those programmes fits with this cultural theme.
And also, I would say, just in terms of cultural risk, of course, John Tulloch has done fantastic work on Doctor Who and risk. And this was risky television. If you've actually heard what Moffat and Capaldi talked about, they very much saw this as risky television.
Post-TV.
When they made it, they didn't know if it would work, and you can see that. So they took incredible risks to create really what I would argue is the first post-television program.
I think so.
And therefore, we're nearing our last couple of questions, Steve, but therefore, noting that this may be the moment of post-television, Doctor Who was children's television when you watched it as a lad. So, therefore, what is Capaldi's Doctor Who? Is it children's television What is it now?
I think he's blurred all the lines,
Yeah.
which is why I'm really interested in what he's doing. And I think he's conscious of blurring all the lines.
He is.
Between, TV and other forms, other cultural forms. And that's definitely been one of the reactions on social media, immediate reactions to these programmes. I think the interesting thing is, what would you do now for the programme? I mean, there is a Christmas edition and a sense that the programme will continue, but you're almost pushing the limits beyond a point where you could carry on.
But again, if you notice, that's bringing incredible excitement back to popular
Very
culture.
much.
My
Yeah,
sadness as someone who is a popular culture scholar, has really based my whole career on thinking pop, if you like. And I have been so sad about the nature of popular culture in the last 15, 20 years. Part of it is, I think, the banality that's been created through reality television. It's not that it's good or bad, it's just that it's boring.
Yeah.
And it's the revelatory, powerful, difficult popular culture that gets inside you and it's like a fingernail and pokes in and disturbs you. Yeah. And I think it's that sort of popular culture we are lacking. There's great highlights, Walking Dead, Breaking Bad, clear examples where they're cutting through as well. Fantastic television, a lot of your great thriller programs, for example.
Yes.
That great Jane Campion program.
Top of the Lake.
Top of the Lake. So there's fantastic examples, but they are few, so that you can name them.
Yes.
Yeah. And Doctor Who is clearly in those categories where we are looking forward to what the hell they're going to do next, because you can't predict it. Now, in dreadful times where endlessly life is predictable, this is remarkable. So I'm going to finish off with a phrase that you've used a lot in the last year or so that I'm incredibly interested in. And in fact, you've already used it in this podcast, and that is high popular culture. What do you mean by that phrase? I'm going to draw you onto that now because you use it a great deal. What is high popular culture, and is Doctor Who now part of that?
I think it is, yes. I would say the current Doctor Who is a great example of high popular culture. I've always been interested in the breakdown of high and low culture, and I think cultural theorists of the last 30 or 40 years have gone in and out of that work, tried to explain it through modernism, postmodernism, post-postmodernism, and so on. But I think the way in which the breakdown of, say, high and low within popular culture has always been the most interesting aspect. Maybe because I grew up thinking that bourgeois culture was basically classical music and opera, and I didn't want anything to do with that. Yeah. So I was interested in what we would now call popular culture, popular music, from a very young age, including popular TV programmes like Doctor Who. So I'd always thought of the breakdown between high and low culture as interesting, but as I developed the work myself, and as a researcher and a writer and a cultural theorist, actually what I was interested in was the breakdown between high and low popular culture, which I think is a constant, they're divisions, they're binary divisions which are constantly playing off each other and accelerating. So I think Doctor Who is a very, very good example of high popular culture.
So do you think that popular culture is in itself fracturing? So
very much so.
In high popular culture, therefore, is it so self-reflexive, engaging, so intelligent, what I've called, of course, thinking pop, that it's requiring different literacy skills to understanding, say, keeping up with the Cardassians?
Yes, very much so. And as you get deeper into what I see as a global cultural crisis, you get that more, and you depend on something like the high popular culture for the morality tales. And they may be fleeting. That's why I say, maybe we're post all of this already. Yeah. But we should take the morality of those kinds of programs. Doctor Who is an important part of actually resetting the way in which we think, the way in which we act, because high popular culture has something to teach us.
I so believe that, and of course that's the andragogical function of popular culture. All my respects to Henry Giroux, wonderful human being who's worked through the pedagogic functionality of popular culture. But what I would say, Stephen, thank you for this conversation. As listeners can hear, we've very much wanted to present this podcast and express a lot of these ideas because it has been a very bad year for the planet. 2015 has been a terrible time for human beings. There's wars everywhere. There's professional attacks on all sorts of institutions, including universities, where a lot of the really strong, powerful organisations of critique that exist on this planet are being destroyed either through a lack of public funding or, out of control, feral neoliberalism. And so we do desperately need those voices, those views, those platforms, those ideas that are offering alternatives, intelligent, conscious, reflexive alternatives, because what they're doing is they are giving us the language to continue the struggle, the language to continue the fight, and at this point we're going to need every help and every companion.
Every single resource.
Every companion that we can get. And I think, ironically, Doctor Who is an outstanding companion for those of us trying to find a way outside and around of neoliberal education.